our elders don't have the best ways of communicating, and they don't know how to state that out. So all they say is like, and it's like, live.
Welcome to the Hmong Women podcast. Like, share, and comment for more. My name is Ariel.
And I'm Dochi.
And I'm Emily.
Today we're going to be talking about how we grew up, growing up traditional versus modern Hmong, and along with that, the differences and difficulties we had.
I had a hard time just trying to figure out kind of where to come from this. So from my perspective, I was trying to figure out how we were defining modern Hmong. I kind of went on how I was defining modern Hmong, and so I was trying to figure out what are the measurements for defining who a modern Hmong person is. So are we defining a modern Hmong person as someone who is Christian versus someone who traditionally is shaman, someone who was born in the States versus someone who was born in Laos or Thailand, someone who was born after a certain timeline as modern Hmong, someone who practices shamanism but in a new wave style, right? Because we've been hearing that. What is a modern Hmong person versus a non-modern Hmong person? And so that's where I'm coming from. I just wanted to put that out there. Not that that's the definition for everyone. Going forward and talking about this, I will be viewing it as like, okay, someone who grew up in a more westernized kind of hybrid of Hmongness versus someone who grew up in a more cultural kind of non-westernized version of being Hmong.
Yeah, I ran into the same difficulties as well. Initially, when we brought up this topic, my thought immediately went to if có yếu tố nên cho cái trai cũ or your cho cái trai cũ là cho cái trai trẻ nữa, as in if you're running your family in the traditional sense with shamanism, or are you someone who now believes in Christianity or other beliefs? So that's what I initially thought about until I started reading more and doing more research. And there are just so many other topics that tied in with that general umbrella of being traditional or being modern. You could be a modern person and still be shaman. You could be a traditional person and be Christian or other beliefs. And so that, definition for me didn't work. And so I think your definition is really what I was looking at. If you're leading your life in a more westernized manner, or in that more old-fashioned sense as, the way they do it, tying into those cultural things, the little tiny things that we think are, for my own self, just your everyday. So that's my take on what being traditional and modernized is. It's either being westernized or taking on the same, way of life as our elders that came from Laos and doing daily activities like that.
Well, to echo what these two ladies have said, I thought about it from a similar perspective, and so I thought about it as traditional means to follow our culture and traditions to the T and hold on to all the same expectations. And then modernized means that you can also follow the culture and traditions, but your thoughts and expectations may be different. Emily calls it westernized. You can also call it like assimilating, becoming more mainstream, or having the more Americanized lifestyle. So, have you experienced difficulties communicating with someone who grew up from the opposite background as you?
Yeah, so for me, growing up in a very traditional home, I grew up in a multi-generational home where I was in the whole mix of not just my parents, both my mom and dad, my grandparents lived with us, and so did my aunt. And so, I just was not used to those smaller homes where it's literally mom and dad, baby, and sometimes no baby, just mom and dad. So I'm used to that loud, obnoxious setting because that's what felt like home to me. I grew up with my grandma was really close to her, so whatever she did was right to me. But she took on, again, a very traditional route. She did not speak English. And so she taught me a lot of the things that she's done her whole life. And to me, that was the way of life. And once I started interacting with others outside of my home, I started to get a little confused because I had assumed that other Hmong people would be like me, that their homes would be operating either like mine or in a similar sense as mine, only to realize that's not true because I would share experiences with them and try to relate with them and come to find they have no idea what I'm talking about. You know, we'll joke about maybe jingle bells, or even when we're talking about, oh, we're going to jingle this weekend, they'd be like, it's not Christmas, you know, we're the middle mart. And having to just explain things. And I feel that once you start to explain things, it's no longer funny. And that kind of caused for us to drift apart because we couldn't find any ground to relate on. Whatever they were experiencing and going through, I also could not relate with them. And it's not a bad thing. It was just that we had a lot of difficulties trying to bridge between one another. And so some things I have jotted down here that I recall having difficulty connecting with is like the big different roles between boys and girls. Not that you don't have that in other settings or even a modernized home. It was just that it was such a focus, how I would act as soon as I got to a party. It was like straight to the kitchen you go. You know, what's going on? What are you guys cooking? And what are you guys doing? While more, I think, modernized daughters, when they get there, they are just there to mingle. And again, nothing wrong with that. But I remember that growing up, the thought was, oh, like they never chat, they la palina. But now that I'm older and I look back at it, if I was hosting and somebody came to my house and they didn't help, I don't think I would be mad. I just don't know why it was such a big thing at that time. And the idea that boys are allowed to do certain things and girls can't do things because they're not a boy. Those are only fitting for like whatever gender role, you know, your identity and how you are physically and how you interact with others. I couldn't dress a certain way. I couldn't do my hair a certain way. I couldn't do my makeup a certain way. You know, I couldn't cut my hair. I couldn't paint my nails. So when I say traditional, I mean like a very, very, very traditional home. I remember I would put tape on my fingers because I wanted like nails, and my mom would paint it. And one time my dad came home and I heard the door shut. I got so scared right after my mom painted it. I was supposed to be drying it. I went like this and literally just crumbled up all my tape nails because I don't know. It was like, it's not, when you look back at it, it's not even a big deal, but those were the rules of our home, the traditional sense of you have to be almost just plain in yourself. And then aside from that, the yearly ceremonies, the typical oneng, hupli, kite, you know, setting up your sika, and all that was something that I experienced, but my modernized cousins didn't have to do that. They didn't have to do the yearly, you know, peyo oneng koche or any of that. So they could not understand that. The butchering and preparation of foods, the titles and the names of understanding is that like, you know, nitai or is that ball. And in English and in a modernized home, they're all just grammar. You know, is it paulo and nitai and danlo, you know, all that stuff. And as a traditional individual, you start to understand like, oh, okay, well, how are you related to so and so forth? And we joke about it so much, but I do find a lot of importance in that though, because I know exactly who you are.
So I mentioned in a previous episode that I grew up in Elk River. Always, no matter where we lived, we always held on to our traditions. So we did everything that Dochi kind of did, where every year we would, you know, oning koche and then oning, you know, oning call, oning shai, and then, you know, we wherever we were, you know, my parents had a sika, and then, you know, my parents even taught us how to, my mom has one right now, and she taught us how to like help her clean it and maintain it because she couldn't, and all that kind of stuff. So wherever we were, we held and maintained those traditions. And I remember one year we had to do a big family one where we all stood in a circle and they tied a string around us, and then the shaman like did this water spit thing. And I remember being the one that got spit on the most. I was like, ugh, what the heck was that? You know? But, you know, so grew up very traditional. And I don't think after fourth grade, I didn't have any issues connecting with other Hmong kids because I went to Hmong schools 4th grade on. From that point forward, I had been exclusively in Hmong schools, so New Millennium Academy and Hmong Academy, now HCPA. So I had always been surrounded by other Hmong peers who were modern or who grew up modern or traditional. And so it was never hard to find someone who could relate. In Elk River, people were like, "What are you?" So they didn't even know who or what I was. So of course that was hard to relate to people. My cousins were all, at least the ones I could remember, were also all a part of that, right? If it wasn't our family, doing a hupli or oning shai oning call, it was our cousins that we were going to go help. If it wasn't a cousin who oning, it was a funeral. If it wasn't a funeral, it was a wedding. If it wasn't a wedding, it was just a family talk, that we would have to go and help and prep for. If it wasn't just a talk, it was, an elder that we're welcoming. And so, it was always something. If it wasn't something for an elder, it was a meeting. And so we had to make sure that we were doing stuff for people who wanted to talk to my dad for meetings and all that kind of stuff. So we were always having to do things. And so we always had to be prepared and look a certain way and be a certain way. And of course, me, I'm a rebel at heart and I hated it. I always hated doing these things and all this. I just hated it. And I just did not like having to always be primmed and prepped and pretty and smile and letting these people just look at you like you're invisible, right? And that was the biggest part, right? It's you give respect, but you don't get respect. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. No, it wasn't difficult communicating with somebody on the opposite end, especially with kids who grew up Modern Hmong, I think, because they went to Hmong school and they were learning about the Hmong culture. They were like, okay, yeah, I know now kids do grow up in households that are more traditional than me.
I love that you both shared that. I think growing up, I definitely had a more hybrid mix because my grandparents didn't live in the same home as us, but they lived less than 10 minutes away. So they were definitely within reach. So my dad actually came over and then he was in California and moved to Minnesota. And then my mom was born here. And then my grandparents came over too. So both my parents my dad was more traditional. My mom was more modern. And my grandparents are definitely still very traditional. And so growing up, I think it was definitely really interesting because I was surrounded on the weekends with cultural traditions and the huplis and the weddings. So I grew up around all those traditions and cultural things that we did and the music. But I think growing up, one really good example of this is my parents constantly pushed us to be a little bit more modernized. So my first language is not Hmong. My first language is English. And currently I can't read or write Hmong. And that's simply just because, not my fault, but it's because my parents just didn't prioritize that. So growing up, I went to a Golden Valley elementary and middle school. And so being surrounded constantly by white people and being one of the few Asian people in the class, I think for a lot of people, if they were in that situation, they wouldn't really like their culture. They'd look down upon it for being different. But I think for me, I was also just really interested on why I was different. And so growing up with really traditional grandparents, that really taught me to embrace who I was, be more curious about what made me who I am, and just fully embrace my identity as a Hmong woman. So other than language, I would say growing up, my dad, for example, worked the first few years of my life. And then, those roles switched. So my mom ended up going to school, finishing, and then she took over making mainly the income for the family. So I think just saying that, a lot of people would be like, what, really? Your dad is willing to stay home? And yeah, it's because, they did become a little bit more modernized in the fact that my mom made a little bit more money. And so that means my dad could stay home to help with the kids. So I don't think I've honestly really not heard a lot of that. But yeah, it's, at least for me growing up, it was pretty normal to see both parents working. It was normal to see your mom working. It was normal to see your mom like not cook. My dad cook and clean. So for me, at least, and my siblings, we grew up with that like very hybrid parenting and cultural style.
Yeah, I actually wanted to add to that a little bit when you mentioned not knowing how to write and read and Hmong because your parents had prioritized speaking English first. It reminds me of a podcast episode that I listened to from Hmonglish with Ye as a host, and he had mentioned something very similar, that his parents, and this is maybe a little bit wrong, just from what I remember, had also prioritized him speaking English, and the modernized ways, because to them it wasn't to rid them of their cultural identity, but it's because in this modern world. And so they did not realize that by prioritizing English and the Western ways, it potentially meant losing, in this case, your language. But it doesn't mean that you can't go back and learn it, I think growing up as someone who I learned Hmong first, I grew up with my grandma. She doesn't speak English, so there was no way I was going to learn English first from her. But I remember from the flip side being scared to be in public because I couldn't communicate with people. I could not tell someone I needed to use the restroom. And it was something as simple as that. And I was, of course, made fun of for it. I remember first day sitting in preschool, and before having been sent off, my mom had prepped me with one line, and that was, I need to use the bathroom if I needed to go to the restroom. And I was so scared to say it, and if I was going to say it right, I just ended up peeing my pants the first day of school. And so, there's pros and cons to each side. But I think overall, our parents really just did what they thought was best. In my case, my parents really did not want us to, or me, to lose my cultural identity, myself as a Hmong person. And so instead of investing in teaching me, English and the Western ways, they went about it 180 from what your parents did, Ariel.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about the difficulties. Also, like, I think that's one of the biggest ones for me is that growing up, having fully fluent first cousins and having fully fluent, like, grandparents and parents, it made it very hard and very stressful as children, like, growing up and not being able to communicate 100% to, like, our grandparents. And I'm very blessed. Like, my grandparents know a little bit of English, so they were able to, like, teach me, and we were able to learn it slowly. But yeah, at the end of the day, our parents didn't prioritize that. So that didn't become our primary language.
I don't know if either of you feel this way, but like when I speak Hmong and I listen to Hmong music and I read Hmong, like there's just something spiritual about it where it makes you feel a certain way. But yeah, I definitely grew up right in the smack dab middle of that, where I had my older siblings who were also parenting me in some way, who were speaking English and they were growing up in the English system. And then I had my parents who were very Hmong and they were only speaking Hmong to me. And that's how it is right now with my nieces and nephews. Like when my mom, before her accident, she was helping to watch my sister's kids. She was only speaking Hmong to them. And then my sister and their partners, halumikasa, and so it's kind of like, so then my niece, would know Hmong when she's with her thai. But then when she's with her mom and dad, she would speak, English and use like ASL and stuff. So, it's really interesting how we grow up and how we're conditioned to know these things. And so, yeah. And again, it's like both of you said, right? It's our parents wanting the best for us and doing what they think is going to help us succeed. And it's really interesting because, I don't know. I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, so I'll edit this out. But I'm like, English?
Leave it in. And
English is not a pretty language. It's not a pretty language. It's not the most spoken language in the world. And it's not even the official language of the United States. So it's just like the fact that people use that as like an excuse to say like, you need to learn English because it's the official language of the United States. That's my decolonized piece of the day.
I really love that. I wish I paid attention more in my lit class, but I remember hearing that and I was genuinely surprised. I'm like, it's not. And if you really think about it, how generally most individuals who are only English speakers, when they're attacking bilingual individuals who might not have the most perfect version of English to present, they start saying things like, why don't you learn English? And a lot of English speakers, such as myself, we don't even understand the language well, very well. And I think Hmong is a very beautiful language. And it saddens me to say that because, and I'm surrounded by a majority of individuals who speak only in English. They can't understand Hmong very well. I'm very scared and sad that I'm losing my language because as what you mentioned, now you're not looking to have kids, but someday I do want to have kids. And I very much want my kids to know how to speak Hmong. There was a conversation I had with someone about the Hmong language and how we go about it. So we tend to make fun of those who cannot, right? But why is that though? Why is it that we make fun of those who are trying their best to learn their own language? It's like, oh, but it's because I used to grow up doing that. And now that I think back, that just holds us back from actually spreading the beautiful language. Because this individual I talked with was like, I want to learn it and I can kind of speak it, but so because people just make fun of it, I just don't say it at all anymore. And I'm like, that's a really ugly reality right there. And I'm sorry that that's what you had to experience. And I think that as a responsibility for those who can speak it, not do that, instead of making fun of your friends who can't speak Hmong very well, teach them, it's not pronounced like this, it's like this. What you're saying is actually that. Because I think of even, again, with myself, but when I was with my ex-mother-in-law and I would be trying to explain something to her, I'm trying to like dig in a hole, like the word is somewhere in here, I just don't know where it is. And I would be umming and like, and she'll be like, oh, and then she'll tell me and she'll just kind of fill it in as we talked. And it was just so natural to the conversation. I didn't think about it until after the fact about how much that helped me to develop my Hmong, as opposed to someone who, if I were to say something and they just made fun of me every single like step of the way, I usually would just get so frustrated. I'm like, you know what, forget it. And like, we'll talk about it another time. So for those of you out there who may be able to relate to that, don't shy away from learning not just Hmong, but your language or any language in general. Because just like anything else in the world, when you're starting to learn something, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to, you're not going to be perfect, because if you were, you wouldn't be learning it along the way. You're going to have some bumps in the road, and that's okay. And for those of us who do know it, just be supportive. There's no need to make mockery out of someone who did not get the privilege of growing up speaking Hmong as a daily existence.
Yep, exactly. My dad does that all the time too. He goes, and I'm like, okay, thank you. And then, and I can't speak it very well, but I'm like, when I can spell it and I can write it. And so then when people are like, well, how do you spell it? And I'm like, you do this. So, I'm confident when spelling, but I can't, and that's the thing is like, I do my best to read it so I know how to say it. But there's a difference between being able to read it and write it and then actually say it, because the grammar is also very, very different when you're speaking it. So,
yeah, no, I full-heartedly agree with that. Sorry, English is hard, see?
Yeah.
It proved the point. But to add on to all this, actually, I wanted to talk about like different expectations, remember, from like family and friends growing up differently too, is like, that's one of the biggest difficulties that I've experienced actually, is like, if my parents could have their way, I would be married with 4 kids in a home and not running a business. So I think that in itself says so much, because I'm none of those things. And I'm sure a lot of you could relate to that. And another big thing that I want to talk about too is like another huge difficulty that I've experienced is no one taking me seriously until I've gotten married. So I think that's something too that makes our culture unique is you are considered a child until you get married because for some reason that makes you a full-grown woman.
First of all, 4 kids in this economy?
Yeah.
No.
With whose money?
Exactly. Like, but no, I definitely hear that, right? It's kind of like I love how you said that, you know, you're a child until you get married. Like my younger sister is married right now. And she's considered like a woman and adult compared to me, right? Like I have cousins and aunts who like, and I see this all the time, right? When we're at like events and she shows up with her husband and like they talk to her as a woman and then they like kind of look at me and they're like, oh, you know, and I'm like, okay, but she knows she's, you know, and I love my sister. So if you're listening to this, I love you. And it's just so funny how it's like, okay, so just because my younger sister got married, you know, all of a sudden she's a woman and I'm not, you know, and it's like, it doesn't make her any less of a woman, but it's like, why are you placing value in that? And it's just so interesting, the conversations that come from the same for a guy too, right? Like he's not a man until he's married. It doesn't matter how successful he is. And it's just like, so he can be an immature, cheating, rude person, but all of a sudden he's married and he's a man. But he doesn't take care of his family. But he's a man because he's married. And same for her. So it just never made sense to me.
There's a lot of things that need to be worked on.
That is definitely a realm that I can add into because I personally got to witness that perspective change. I lived my life what I consider in a backwards manner. I don't think there's actually obviously a manual to live life, but I got married very young, and with that came a lot of responsibilities that I was not fully prepared or equipped for. And my partner or ex-partner was amongst the middle child of his family. And I am an only child and I'm a daughter. And when we got married, I remember just continuously having to hear, you know, cái này có chỉ yêu lại cái linh sư chỉ chiều, you know, ôm yêu nên cái rong á, chỉ sợ kia lo hại con á, and just don't do anything that embarrasses us. It wasn't even you know, live your life happily and things that are more focused on, I think, what should be the married couple. It was very much focused on don't embarrass your parents and us. Those are mainly the conversations that I had in my send away. And you're right in the fact that your status somehow just bumps 20 levels. And that was also something I was not prepared for because I am a child, or I was. I kind of am, but like I was so young. I didn't live life yet, and I was barely starting my life. I just started college, and I was all of a sudden elevated into the status of a grown woman, and I didn't fully understand that initially. But all of a sudden I was having to cook and clean, and as you mentioned, I would go to places and I was being more recognized. And because my partner played quite a role in the community, all kinds of community, you know, there were a lot of questions every time I went somewhere like, hey, got to see, like, where's your husband? And sometimes I'm like, you know, like, you're not seeing it as an individual anymore because your identity is so heavily tied to your partner. And that was what really sucked because my successes was nothing without him. And it was really hard to find my footing for myself, and to say like this was my accomplishment. But everything that he accomplished, whether I was there to support or not, was his accomplishments. So I was merely a shadow in a sense, is how I felt. And then post-divorce, realizing how, like, I knew I was going to be shunned in some sense or way because a young divorced Hmong woman, or just a Hmong woman who is divorced in general, it's a frowned upon status. Like, nobody wants to be that, because automatically you are in the wrong regardless of what the story is. But in this episode, we're not here to share that. What I am here to share is how you're looked at, especially in a traditional community where you typically any kind of setting, they will recognize you, oh, nyatolo, on tolo, whatever. But now it's almost like they're just snickering at you as if you cannot see them. And it's like, look, if you have something to say, feel free to ask. It's not like I'm going to answer it, but it does not change who I am from like the beginning to the end. Like, I am just who I am, but I'm just so tired of having your identity tied to your partner in these kind of settings. It's exhausting overall.
Yeah, tied to your partner or tied to how you look, right? And it's like, I can say this from my personal experience where this, and I get this comment all the time. I've gotten it since the moment I was 3 years old. But it's like, oh, you know, you know, like I get that comment all the time. And it's like, first of all, who said I'm looking? Second of all, like my value is not tied to a man, right? And I don't have to like be married and have kids right now to like have value as a Hmong daughter. Like, I'm here at this event helping you and your family, like the way I was taught as a traditional Hmong daughter. And yet I still am being devalued to my face. And that's where the issue is. And like, that's what I meant earlier, where it's like, why am I here when I'm being disrespected to my face? And like, they always say that, oh, well, it's for the betterment of you. And it's like, well, imagine if I said that to your face. Hey, you know, you've got a bald spot, auntie. You know, like, I'm pretty sure you don't want me to say that, you know?
Say it.
Like, that's just rude. Yeah, well, it's for the betterment of you. Do you know you have that, you know? And it's like, that's just rude. And it's like,
Just trying to get over it.
yeah. And it's like, you know, and it's like, well, yeah, hey, you know, like, yeah, I know I'm a chubby girl, but like, what value does that give your, you know, your nieces and nephews, right? And it's like, what is that encouraging to your nieces? Like, oh, you know, you should get married young. And I know that's like the life that you grew up in back then, right? And that's, again, where we get back into that conversation of traditional versus modern, right? And I think there are some things that, you know, and I tell this to my mom all the time, like, there's some things that, you know, it's okay to take modern things into our traditional household for, right? It's okay if your daughter is 35 and not married, if she's successfully living her life, right? She's not a spinster in a bad way. If she's successfully living her life and she's providing for herself and she's providing for you, what's wrong with that?
Well, I definitely think growing up, like, my parents told us, you know, you have to learn how to cook and clean. You have to make sure that, you know, you are wife material to make sure someone wants to marry you. But I do think that, like, that played a huge role into my life, too, because I grew up thinking that, too, that I have to get married and I have to do this and that to be this perfect version of myself. And I think for the moment out there, too, like, what are your thoughts on this? And did you feel any pressure in that way to be perfect and to also be doing things in a certain way? Because, you know, personally, from my perspective, my male first cousins, they grew up in a like way more relaxed state where, like, you know, they come over to your house and they don't cook or clean, they just play. And I think seeing that, it was just really confusing to me as a little girl, because it's like, why am I pressured to do all this stuff when I don't even want to do it? And I think that's the hard thing too, is like, I plan on having kids also, and that's one of the big things that I do talk to my partner about, is how do we plan on raising these kids so not only are they embracing their culture and their identity, but at the same pace understanding that they get to choose how much of it comes into their life as well. And I think for, you know, a lot of folks out there, that's a really big thing to consider, especially when you're marrying someone and bringing someone into the family, is how acceptive of them, of your culture, and just how does that combine all together. And obviously I'm not married yet, but I've seen other instances as well where, you know, people are brought up traditionally And so they're expected to cook, clean, take care of the kids, do everything around the house. But then they're also, at a full-time job. And so I've seen just the worst, experiences as well, where people aren't happy in their marriages after that because they both were brought up traditionally. And because of that, the guy just doesn't do anything. And he's not there emotionally, physically to help the kids. So I think it just sometimes it really does play a huge impact on us, and it can play a huge impact on our roles and sort of our relationships that we have.
Yeah. I did want to add a perspective to that from when I was married, because I had a lot of, I love my elders, so I actually engage more with the elders than I did with individuals in my age group. And I found a lot of meaningful conversations in trying to understand why they say the things they do. Like, for example, earlier, Emily, you were mentioning how, they focus so much on your appearance, and it's like all that ties back to like, oh, you're going to be able to get married because you don't look this certain way or not. And everything just seems to always go back to getting married. And there was a time with my ex's family where one of the brothers, well, not one of them, because we were the only one married. And so, are they ever going to get married? Like, we're getting old. And two, I think a lot of individuals in our age group, what we hear is a lot of whining, and it's like, what is the big deal with it? And I fully understand that because I feel that way too. And it wasn't until these conversations that I came to understand that it comes out of worry, because we have to also be able to see from their perspective. And this is just to share with our viewers, if you're having difficulties having conversations with your parents and it's ensuring to them that you are okay. And I'm not going to say it's going to work. I'm just saying. It's an understanding that a lot of times they're ushering you, especially as daughters, to get married, because when they grew up, you're gonna and everything was so physical, everything was manual labor, and the thought was a woman could not do as much without a man in the home. And how are you going to stock up and get ready for like those winter seasons if you don't have a man to help out? So if you're not married, you're gonna see struggles in your future. And so they're so accustomed to getting married young so that they can have a successful life, that getting married it's now translated to having a successful life. And it's just never quite shifted for them from coming from overseas here. And so now whenever they see any of their kids not married, they also worry about like, like, what if I die? Like, who's going to help you to and do all that if I'm gone? But they don't know how to do that because, as we know, our elders don't have the best ways of communicating, and they don't know how to state that out. So all they say is like, and it's like, live.
Most dramatic
Yeah.
way possible.
They go at it at the most dramatic form as they possibly can. And it's like, and then, from there, you just get into a bickering fight and it goes nowhere. But again, through conversations, I've just come to learn it comes from a lot of worries, and continuously reassuring them, like, I will be okay. Like, I don't need to have that. And again, I don't think it's going to work, but it does ensure them a little bit more every single time they see that you are successful. They're just so used to the idea that girls can't go to school. Like, I was watching this guy who, to this day, he does some vlogs out in like Laos and China. And he would do little interviews with them and ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it was really sad for me to see that in today's world, the little boys would have these bigger dreams, and the little girls like, oh, because I'm just so tired of staying here. And then he would ask them how their education was. What do they like in school? It's like, oh, school, because we needed people to watch the younger kids, or for someone to help. And it just made more sense for my brother to go to school. So my brother goes to school, but I don't. And so the opportunities we have here are just almost, I think, still beyond our parents' imagination as a girl, especially. But that's a perspective that I was able to gain in the conversations I've had with our elders that I also really appreciated.
No, I definitely hear where you're coming from with that. And I hear that 100,000%, because we have that conversation with our parents all the time. Right. My parents say that with my three brothers because they're unmarried. It's, when are you guys going to get married? Because when we have our funerals, right, how are you going to, because your wives are going to play a big part in how you prepare our funerals, right? And how you carry yourselves forward, and taking care of your families and this Vang family. And so that plays a big part of it too, is carrying on the tradition and how you will carry forth your name as a son. And so that is very important. And that, I know that that's why they also asked that too, right? And that's also why I brought up, right, that it's also important for not just children to understand the parents, but for the parents to understand the children, and that the parents should also understand like where we're coming from kind of this modern point of view, right? It's like, I understand that, you grew up, with this point of view, but, as you can see, we grew up with these educational opportunities that it's not the same as it was before. And so, from where I'm coming from, it's like, okay, well, I see where you're coming from. Do you see where I'm coming from? Right. What I'm trying to say is like, it really is a matter of sitting down with your parents, if that's who it is, or your aunts and uncles. And for me, it was with my parents, and saying like, I need you to listen, right? Because they were unwilling to listen, and being like, I'm not telling you that I hate being Hmong, because that was a big point of contempt for us, is that they thought that I hated being Hmong. They thought that I hated our culture, that I didn't want to be Hmong anymore. And it's like, it's not that I hate being Hmong, that I don't want to be part of the culture. It's the fact that you think that I don't want to be, right? It's the fact that you keep forcing me to do things that I don't want to do. And so, a big part of it was like, I really did want to detransition from being like a Hmong daughter. It is a two-way street, right? It's understanding, okay, if I'm doing this, you also have to like give me a reason why. You can't just say, "Only like you only know some," it's just how we've always done it. Then you just do it. I'm not asking questions to be a butt. I'm asking questions so I can understand why we're doing this. And I understand some people ask questions because they want to be an asshole, but it goes both ways, right? It's one, you understanding the parent and the elders, but two, the elders also have to take time to understand the child, right? That's how a dynamic works. It's not one way, it's two way. So I appreciate that perspective, but I also wanted to add another layer to that too. So.
Yeah, and I think you both have sort of covered it already, but do you both think there's a wall between two ends of the community?
For my take, I definitely felt that there was a big wall in the community that I was living in, growing up, because there was such a difference, and I don't have the right word to describe what exactly it was. It wasn't hostile or anything. It was passive, where we would join communities and do things and events together, but it was like an elephant in the room that we disliked those who and those who did run more modernized home also did not like us, because they felt that we were uncivilized, and to tie into their religious ways, feeding to the devil. And so there was a lot of things that like kind of kept us separated from one another. But as kids, we just knew that we wanted to play with each other. But back at home, I think behind closed doors, we understood very well that we were different from one another because of that. And when I got older and I moved out here, I started to see mixes of it. I was always under the impression that you couldn't be like in like a hybrid setting where you could have lead a mixture of kind of both that traditional and modern life and mesh it together. So when I started to experience that, I actually fell in love with it because I still do like my traditional ways, but I did leave a lot of it behind for what was unfitting to what I was trying to elevate myself to. It was just not right for me. And doesn't mean that I'm no longer cultural or traditional. I think some things that people misunderstand with that is they think that to be cultural or traditional means that you're adhering to what I consider are specific like preferences of the elders. So like for example, when they're talking about shamans do this and that and they they prefer girls over boys. Shamanism in itself does not prefer a man over a woman. It is the people that prefer the man over the woman. There is no only, tsineng, chimonyaneng, yimonyaneng, tsineng, but they prefer that le chataneng for le tutu than le tuncai because tuncai mo okwa. And so therefore there is no benefit to the family to invest in their daughters because of how much they lacked in that time. It's the people, it's not the religion from my perspective. So that's the take I have on that piece.
I don't have too much to add, but when that question came up, I was thinking there's not necessarily a wall, but when I thought of it, I just thought there are a lot of clashes. So, like, it's sort of like what you were saying, like, people are in the same room, we get along together, but at the end of the day, behind closed doors, like, we say and do other things opposite of our behavior in the room. And I feel like that's sort of the way that I saw it growing up, too, is that there's not really a wall. Like, we talk to each other, but they're just huge clashes in terms of, like, just one of my aunts saying to her sister, like, oh, you let your daughter do that? Or just having different expectations of children and people in their lives that live differently from the way that they do.
I think we need to extend a little more empathy to learning. Because I feel both of your points, right? I think whether we are Hmong Christian, Hmong shaman, or Hmong atheist, right? Whatever our belief system is, there needs to be less judgment of what our belief system is, because at the end of the day, I've seen whatever belief we are, we always go back to the spiritual aspect of, it must be something within our spiritual belief system of, Mong keke, belief system. And then that too is stop judging other people's children because you don't know how people raise them.
To add on to that, to bridge the two, I think it really does take a lot of patience and curiosity. And I think it also is people being open-minded enough to actually do the work and to stay curious.
Thank you for joining us today for our 6th episode. For our episode, whatever it is. I'm going to keep this in there. About talking about traditional Hmong versus modern Hmong households and how we grew up. So if you enjoyed today's episode, tell us in the comments about your experience, how you grew up, whether it was in a modernized or traditional Hmong household. And if you could relate to any of our takes, we would love to hear your point of view. So again, if you liked our episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, or follow us, and we will see you next time.